Now, isn't it amazing where you have a meeting with people before they join a war on your side? It really is. And here's the thing. When I start to talk about the Atlantic Charter, people usually go, well, that's an agreement from World War II which sets out a lot of the things to do with the modern day, and it's by Britain and America. And I go, yes, it is. Just one small issue. When it is put out after a conference in August 1941, America has yet to join the war. And that's why I'm doing this video live on the 14th of August, and this is why also this particular video will be, going out far longer down the track. I think probably in January. January 2026, because it's rather appropriate for it to be bookended at the 2 points of it going out in August and it going out in January. It's August. This is when it was signed. This was signed 84 years ago. By January 1942, it had a lot more meaning. It really did. And this is one of many things which are why Hitler believes strongly that America is going to be going to war with him soon. And in his view, great powers are not declared war on, they declare war on others. That's always a good idea. Let's cause ourselves maximum problems by increasing the pace of conflict. It's a really interesting scenario, though, if, Germany doesn't declare war on America and Italy doesn't, and it's a scenario of, well, we'd be in a bit of a pickle then. But, luckily, Hitler and Mussolini, it's often forgotten that Mussolini declared war on the 11th of December 1941. It gets forgotten. We all remember Hitler declaring war. We all remember, of course, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but people forget Mussolini declared war on the 11th of December 1941 as well. He did. All that happened, but that is months ahead of when we're discussing. Months ahead. We've got to get through the rest of August, the whole of September, the whole of October, the whole of November, and it's December, and well into December, by the time that all becomes relevant. And yet, we're actually, to an extent, at the second Allied conference. It's already been an inter-Allied conference in June that America has been part of. And this is the first official meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt. And they bring everyone. They bring all their buddies. They bring all their friends. This is a get-together of the gang. And this is also the sort of conference which takes time to arrange. They're not just randomly out for a cruise, both of them, and one in a battleship, the other one in a couple of cruisers, both with escorting sections of destroyers. No. They are all arranged. And like all meetings, they have things arranged in advance. There's been a huge amount of diplomacy, a huge amount of phrasing of what's going to be said, what's going to be discussed, what the text they are probably going to agree to is being agreed beforehand. There will be edits, there will be resolves, there will be final changes on this. In fact, in terms of this treaty, it changes during this meeting. But 90% of it is agreed long before the two principals ever meet. Because you don't want to have that pressure. You don't want to have the principals meeting and them suddenly deciding they don't like the treaty in any way, shape or form. That'll cause you problems. That'll cause you earache. That'll cause you to get in trouble. So yes, this is an interesting time. So who does come? Who do they bring? Who do these two great men bring to a system? And I'm using the phrase great men here because, well, I don't know what else you could describe them at the time. They are great men of their time. They bring a very impressive retinue. With Roosevelt comes Admiral Ernest J. King, who was, of course, in this earlier picture, looking oddly jovial. One wonders what he's done to someone to be looking that happy. Admiral Harold R. Stark. General George C. Marshall of the U.S. Army. Major General Henry H. Arnold, U.S. Army Air Forces. Presidential Advisor Harry Hopkins. And Special Envoy to Europe, Averell Harriman. Useful people to have there. Roosevelt's always being nicely assisted. He needs it. And frankly, I do find it interesting the way, when discussing this topic with students, I go, would a modern country like America, elect someone in a wheelchair who used a wheelchair for as much time as Roosevelt did? Now, often leads to an honest debate because of the traditional imagery that goes with politicians, and how they are perceived, and how leadership is perceived, and how the function of leadership is perceived. But Roosevelt, you can't deny it, does a fairly decent job. I don't like what he does to the various people over Pearl Harbor, because he takes a risk, and then when it gets called and it gets shown the bluff was false, he puts the blame on everyone else. But I recognise that's the political game. I don't like it, but I recognise that that's the political game. It makes him a bit of a... It doesn't make him a bad leader. From the UK came Winston Churchill. Came General Sir John Dild of the British Army. Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound, Royal Navy. Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, Royal Air Force. Permanent Under Secretary Sir Alex Cardigan. Minister of Supply Lord Beaverbrook. And there's also from the Dominion of Newfoundland, there was the governor there, Vice Admiral Sir Humphrey Walren, as he was hosting things. He was there as well. What I would like to point out, you might have noticed there's already a bit of an issue going on here. The British have some 5 stars there. And this is probably the first meeting where it seems Roosevelt himself realizes face to face there are going to be problems coordinating with allies because of the way the US Armed Forces are run. Where everyone's a rear admiral, but are acting more senior. So when he starts to realize there are issues here, there are potential problems here, and it does over time get sorted out. It's one of the things you have to deal with is that if your officers might be very qualified, but the thing is, rank structure doesn't work on who's qualified and who's best. It works on who's senior, because it has to. Because everyone might be equally qualified, but you need a chain of command. One of the things that's often interesting to try and explain as a historian when I'm teaching students about warfare is the pace of decision making. And decisions have to be taken quickly, because the time you spend waiting to take those decisions can lead to more issues. It can lead to your enemy getting inside your decision loop. The most dangerous position for your troops to be is sitting still in indecision. It's safer to be attacking on the wrong route than it is to be sitting still in indecision, because if you're sitting still, that's artillery and bye-bye. And artillery can always wipe you out. It's always happy to. So you need a decision-making process, which means you need to have someone in command. Someone clearly in command. This doesn't matter whether it's a fleet, an air force, or an army. You need to have people in charge, and there needs to be know who's going to be taking that decision, because If your first debate is who's going to be taking the decision, that's going to take a long time before you actually get around to making the frigating decision. So the first thing you need clearly is who's going to be taking the decision. And that usually goes to the person with the most seniority, because they have the most experience, the most gold leaf on them, or whatever, or filigree. That's the person who's trusted with their seniority and given command. And yeah, well, if there is an admiral of the fleet sitting there, and an admiral sitting there, and the admiral's a brevet admiral whose actual substantial rank is rear admiral, then theoretically it's going to be the admiral of the fleet who takes the decisions. The British do start adapting around this. There's a reason why, the various officers in charge of things like the British Pacific Fleet are very careful about where they turn up, because they realise they aren't providing the largest forces at that time. As time goes on and the British Pacific Fleet expands in size, then they can start coming out more seniorly. But if they come out as senior, if they come out from the get-go with their full senior officers, that's going to cause command issues and coordination issues, because they're going to be a rank senior to their American counterparts. And when you have agreed that the ranks will work for operations, because you have to get it to work at all levels, that can cause issues. So both sides have to be quite tactful with it. And this is the experience where they learn that, because, the US turns up with all these senior officers who are very senior to them. And immediately they find themselves dealing with an admiral of the fleet and an air chief marshal. And it's a case of, yeah, we don't, they outrank us. And it's made a no ranks meeting and various other things to sort it out. But then you have the civilians coming along. Now, having Alexander Cadogan along is useful. Permanent Undersecretary Cadogan is a very good negotiator. He's a very good person for keeping negotiations on track and listening. He pays a lot of attention. And Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Supply. Because at this point, America wasn't supplying personnel, but they were supplying a lot of equipment and a lot of munitions. And therefore, Lord Beaverbrook is the person most intimately connected with it. And basically, this is a chance for him to meet them all. Harry Hopkins being there is also useful. He is pretty much Roosevelt's de facto civilian chief of staff at this point. His military chief of staff is pretty much William de Lehy, who isn't there. But the thing is, you have to remember, the chief of staff as a position, the White House chief of staff, doesn't technically exist at this point in time. It's 1939 that Roosevelt managed to get the executive office of the president approved by Congress. And even then, it wasn't until 1953, when Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, that the permanent and preeminent assistant of the president was designated and given the title Chief of Staff of the White House. So we have to consider we're dealing with a very nascent organization here. On both sides to an extent, but honestly, it's really weird because the British organization is always the Cabinet Secretary and the Cabinet Office, which itself was formed in 1916 from the Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence. Basically, Sir Maurice Hankey, who was the first Cabinet Secretary, had been the Secretary for the Committee of Imperial Defence, and he forms it into the Cabinet Office. And that is the organisation which has pretty much been running British government and being the centre point of British government and supporting the Prime Minister's office and all the other things now for, well, today, over 108 years, but since December 1916. So Britain had gone through this very interesting transition itself about 20 years previously to when Roosevelt is trying to induct it. And that's what we're seeing here. You see, the people who aren't mentioned, and this is the important thing, people who aren't mentioned by name here also matter. And we can see some of these people in the photos. For Roosevelt, he brings Sumner Welles with him, also, from the State Department. And, of course, Averell Harriman is also responsible for, well, he's basically Beaverbrook's counterpart. Basically, Beaverbrook's counterpart. He's in charge of Lend-Lease administration. But for Churchill, there is a whole slew of other staff people here, all sorts of people from the Cabinet Office, etc., that he brings with him. And it's one of the first times where Roosevelt really gets to see, oh, that's what running a war looks like in terms of with your team. You see, this is the really big difference between America at this point and Britain at this point. It's one has gone through World War I the whole way through and had to administer it, and now it's in a Second World War and it's having to manage multiple fronts and organise things, and it's again administering it, and it has all those people. American World War I, they were involved in it, but they get involved really at the end, and they don't really have the length of time that they actually do anything more than temporary measures on their administration side. They really don't change things and evolve things as much as they need to. They don't need to. They're not in for long. The war doesn't last long enough after they get involved for them to really have to confront those issues and deal with it. They can manage to admin their way through, or rather ad-lib their way through. Now they're looking at a very different beast. We often talk, when we're talking about US politics, about the expansion of the agencies under the New Deal program, under the Roosevelt New Deal program. That is nothing compared to the expansion of the Executive Office and various other things during World War II to run and prosecute World War II. Because suddenly the executive branch has to deal with so much more. It's having to run so much more day to day. It's having to deal with so much more information day to day and organize so much more information day to day and manage so much more information day to day. And make decisions on more things, not just by the president, but in the name of the president. Because, believe it or not, you start realizing very quickly once you're organizing this, that whilst, yes, the president's office needs to be informed, and there needs to be a decision coming from the executive branch, does the president need to be informed of everything to make every minor decision? Let me give you a classic case. It's quite a funny thing during this meeting, when the food options are being discussed. For Churchill, it's a bit of a surprise. For the president, he's already been briefed and had to input on the menu. Yes, his office needed to be informed, but there is no reason the president should have been told. But the reality is, there's so few people in that office that basically the president is the line manager. So the president is the person they check to. There's not enough junior people. It's a interesting time, really is. And yes, people can make points these days that both offices have expanded massively. In the UK, I'm not going to speak about the executive branch, but in the UK, the Cabinet Office is now, well, it's very much a functioning part of the UK government with over 10,000 members of staff and a budget of over 2 billion. Over 2 billion a year. But, you know, these things happen, especially in bureaucracy. What they're meeting on is also interesting because, well, the US Navy doesn't really have that many modern battleships to go around. And they're trying to keep this, to an extent, a little bit on the down low. So they send a couple of heavy cruisers and a whole host of destroyers. Nice of them. 5 destroyers, 2 heavy cruisers. It's a good force. The British are meeting on home turf. Newfoundland is one of their dominions, one of their sort of colonies, after all. So they bring slightly less, because they have the home court advantage and they have other ships not very far away. They bring Prince of Wales, a battleship. They bring a destroyer from the Royal Navy and 2 from the Royal Canadian Navy. And most of the talking, most of the discussions will actually take place aboard Prince of Wales. Now there's a good reason for that. She has the most space. She is by far the one with the most space available for it. And makes sense. It also allows the British to host it, and the British are hosting because, well, they're in their territory. It might be technically meeting in the North Atlantic, but it's meeting off the coast of Newfoundland, which is British territory. So, it's a nice, secure place to meet on also, because it means that there are no signals going in or out without your permission, and the only people who are going to be aboard are going to be people who have your permission to be there. It's very difficult for spies or anyone to infiltrate. It's very difficult for there to be listening devices set up. The fact that we have so many candid photographs and like these wandering around is because there's official photographers aboard and they can take photos when they want and it can be checked later. There's no need to shoo photographers away. It's also nice to have Prince of Wales here because it's a reminder of what the Royal Navy's been going through and capable of. The fact that they can quickly repair their ships and bring them back to standard. The fact that the Royal Navy has been actually fighting these battles. It's a nice thing to have something. Also, it's the tumults of war because, let's be honest, Prince of Wales hasn't always had the most success. And suitably enough, this is the ship which is soon to be dispatched to the Far East as part of Britain's commitment to the Pacific, commitment to our allies and dominions in the Pacific, and also as a statement of intent for British support of American operations should they be needed in the Pacific. Because, again, you have to consider this charter takes place in the view of rising Japanese tensions, and they do understand that. Britain has been pointing guns at Japan and having guns pointed back at them in January 1939, January 1940, and pretty much almost every January prior to that for the previous 10 years. There have been various incidents. It's been an ongoing thing. January 1941 was also interesting, but curious enough, no guns pointed at each other. But that is, to an extent, the British expecting things to happen in January 1942 at this point. That is realistically what the British are expecting to happen. They're expecting it to be January 1942 because they've seen the way the Japanese are working. They've seen what the Japanese are investing in. They have ideas and intelligence coming through. And it's similar to the Americans. Both of those nations are thinking that Japan is going to go to war soon. They don't know how soon. Both are thinking net of 42 sometime. To be fair, in intelligence terms, they're not out of the ballpark, and realistically, you should be preparing. If you think war is going to be 1942 sometimes, you should be preparing to be ready for war in late 1941, so you've got time to bed in and make sure everything's ready. But, we all get caught on the hop occasionally. So what were the objectives for each side? Now, each side is coming with their own objectives. I would argue that for Roosevelt, probably his 4 freedoms speech, which is always an interesting thing when you start getting into the 4 freedoms and the practicality of them. Number 1, freedom of speech and expression. That's fine. Freedom of worship, very easy. Freedom from want and freedom from fear. That's slightly more difficult. Okay, and let me explain. Freedom from want. One of the basic rules we've established for human rights is no human has the right to the labour of another. No human has the right to a labour of another. So that's about what rules slavery. Which is what the problem of freedom from want comes through. Of, okay, well, you want food, but we can't coerce people to give you food, because that's putting them under forced labour, because they're not getting paid for it. So you have to say freedom from want has to be something you can achieve, but you can't really legislate for. You can't really encapsulate in that rule. And freedom from fear, well, it's a nice idea, and it certainly was the idea behind League of Nations, and the idea behind the United Nations, and the idea behind a lot of these multilateral efforts. Freedom from fear. But the trouble is, you can't legislate for other people and other leaders of the world. You can't. These freedoms are great things, and he believes if he can get them, articulate them in the State of the 1941 State of the Union address. He feels if he can get them, put into a charter, that he can get the American people to support the war. Let me put it this way: he's not going to get them, because a lot of people are looking at him going, those sound so nice until you put them in practicality. 1 and 2, easy. Done. Free. We'd like a world which was free from want. We'd like a world that's free from want. But before you can have an entirely automated, computerized process, in even that case, that's who's going to own the means to production of the food there? Who's going to put the money in to make the means of production, etc.? It's very difficult to get freedom from want into an actual law without having to push on that you now have a right to the labour of others, which means you tacitly agree with slavery. It's just... It's just a problem. Either everyone's taught to farm and we all become subsistence farmers, but then you are not going to be free from want because subsistence farming is incredibly inefficient. Or you have to sort of try and manage that economically. You have to try and manage that in terms of producing food at a scale which it's going to be affordable, and there's enough jobs and enough money in the system that people can usually acquire their own food. Freedom from fear, well, you might as well legislate that the sky will always be pink. You can't. Unless you're going to start running around the world looking at world leaders and going, oh, you can't become leader of your country and your people can't select you because you are too aggressive and might cause trouble, might try and take other people's territory, so we're just going to eliminate you. Well, one of the core points to have freedom of speech and expression, etc., is freedom to appoint who they choose to represent them. This is the problem. For the British, the objectives are quite simple. They want to get the Americans into the war. The British are, to an extent, starting to reach a level of, so you are basically doing everything. You're pushing the Atlantic, you're pushing a neutrality zone across the Atlantic, which is why Admiral King was here. You are pushing all sorts of preferential trade deals our way to supply arms and armaments. All these things are taking place, and you're not doing anything yourself. There's even various, American units, or rather voluntarily American units fighting alongside the Allies at various points around the world, staffed with young officers who are getting their battle experience fighting alongside the Allies to better prepare themselves for service in the American forces, because they basically have been given leave to go and do these things. But yes, the British are seeking to push the Americans closer, or if not, bring them actually into the war, actively. And there is a whole interesting discussion of what happens if the Americans do join the war before Japan can attack. if America's actually put onto a full-time war footing before Japan attacks, etc., because they joined the war. It's unpopular, though, with the American people, and that's, the thing that Roosevelt is dealing with, the legacy of World War One. He's trying to manage that. He's trying to make this unambiguously a war for something which the American people, he feels, will approve of. And realistically, that's an uphill battle. That's an uphill battle. It's honestly difficult seeing how he joins the war earlier than 1943 if Japan doesn't launch its attack in December 1941. At the pace of political movement in America. It's honestly difficult to see. Unless he's attacked in the in-between time by the Germans, and whilst Hitler is getting prepared to declare war, he isn't going to jump on it in December 1941 unless the Japanese jump in first. Because, as he says, he won't. Great powers are not declared war on, they declare war on others. That's completely not a twaddle, but, it's Hitler. He has some very interesting strategic notions, although he is by no means responsible for all the bad decisions made by Germany during World War II. There are a lot of people who push all the blame on him and try and take all the good ideas themselves. The good ideas are more things which can be spread around. The bad ideas are definitely more spread around. But anyway, we're at the Shameless book plug. So, Shameless book plug. Let's see. What are we going to talk about today in the Shameless book plug? Well, I'm going to say thank you to everyone for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow, aren't we? Really? We are. Okay. You probably don't realise how often he is in here because he's so active when there's lives on, and he thinks he can get biscuits out of the chat by basically just, looking cute at the chat until they put PTs in there. He does a lot during chats, but people don't realise that during the recordings he's often sitting on my feet. You join me for the recordings. Your brother joins me for the research, doesn't he? He seems to prefer it when I'm quietly reading or researching than when I'm actually writing or talking. He's a good boy. They're both good boys. Anyway. So, what's the Shameless book plug? Well, as far as I go, thank you for liking, sharing, supporting the channel, helping it grow. Thank you for doing all those things down there, which are currently level with the poodle head. Thank you for making this channel possible. And, well, when this video comes out, oh goodness knows, hopefully the next competition will have started, hopefully the second Historia Fun will have gone well, hopefully Japan trip will have gone well, hopefully there'll be a second book out. We'll see where I am in any of these things by then, because at the moment, and this is the thing I'm dealing with when I'm recording this, is that the house sale on the house has now, on the Epsom house, is now into its 10th week of will I be going next week up to close up the house or will I not be? So it is kind of taken over everything because I can't do anything other than really wait for that and, have to try and prep everything so I'm covered for next week and everything's working and doing everything around that with the idea that I'm not going to be here the following week. Which has been fun and has been a challenge. A real challenge. But we'll see where I am. Oh, good lord, what are you up to now? You just decided you wanted to jump up and be in the centre, didn't you? Okay, alright. Anyway, thank you for your support, thank you for helping the channel go, and thank you for doing everything you do that makes it possible. Thank you. Now, the charter itself was... Well, originally they were aiming for 10 points. But 8 made the cut to be discussed. They wanted 10 because 10 commandments, 10... Again, it's symbology. Politics is a lot about symbology. International relations is a lot about symbology. Sometimes, if you want to try and make something stick and actually make it pay attention, you need to wrap it up in some symbology. And so they were looking for 10. They ended up with 8. They should have probably started with about 16 things and dialed it down, but then they'd probably be worried they'd have ended up with too many. So they started off with 10 and hope they get 10. And the fact that you got all this from Churchill, all this editing from Churchill, And broadly speaking, they're debating each of these things, and they're debating each of these topics. Broadly speaking, one, and I've got the actual charter further on. So please note, we've got the actual text of the charter further on another slide. But this is the discussion of the charter and what they're looking for and what points they're looking for. Broadly speaking, one was going to be no territorial gains sought by the United States or United Kingdom. That's nice. One's the world's largest empire. The other one is vast majority of a continent. Glad they're not seeking extraterritorial gains. I think they could both agree with that from the get-go. Any territorial adjustments that were done must be in accord with the wishes of the people concerned. Now, this is an interesting one because it means that theoretically, if you're going to redraw the maps and borders after the war, you have to get the people's consent to it. And it doesn't say just of the Allies, it says of any people's wish of the people's concerned. Okay, that's going to be more problematic, but we can deal with that. All people have a right to self-determination. Oh, that sounds nice, but again, one of these people, the one who's actually fighting the war at this point, is an empire, which is depending on its empire to be able to fight the war. That can be more problematic. Trade barriers were to be lowered for all involved. Nothing too wrong with that. There has always been this idea consistently that free, fair trade means that you prevent conflict and war by allowing for equitable distribution of resources. The reality is, if it's completely free and fair, it often seems to be that the resources go to where they command the most money. And it often tends to be the stronger economies. You see, free and fair trade works when you're dealing with economically, I would not say the same, but equitable nations. Nations which, whilst they might not be the same in size, but are on a similar level of economic and industrial development. So they both can, offer things fairly and compete for things fairly. When it's between countries which are resource rich but industrially and, I would say, industrially and service-wise poor, then often they can find themselves suffering. But it's such a nice idea, isn't it? It's such a nice idea. And there was to be economic cooperation between the powers and a mutual agreement to the advancement of social welfare. Again, it's a nice idea. I think it's a nice way to put it well, and it's nothing. There's nothing really here that you can go, wow, that's cutting the world, or that's something I absolutely hate. It's all nice ideas, practicality of them might be a different matter, but they're all nice. They're there. The participants would work for a world free of want and fear of war and threat. Broadly speaking, that's point 6. That's the debates were around. And I put in, these are very much my own words, but there's only so many ways you can rephrase this. I do realise there are other people who put some very similar phraseologies up there, but these are, if I explain these words, I first used in a presentation on the Atlantic Charter about 10 years ago, and I wrote up and and it sits in my notes. And basically, I looked at the Atlantic Charter, I looked at other people, and I said, right, I want to put this together in such phraseology, it sparks debate on these topics. So yeah, there are people who've done similar things. So I don't so much claim ownership. I'm just saying these are mine, but there are others which are very similar because mostly they've been put together by academics who are wanting to get a class to debate these topics. So if we put out in this sort of phraseology, rather than as later when I show you the actual Atlantic Charter and you'll listen to the phraseology, you go, yeah, that's not going to make much of a debate. It's a diplomatic treatise. Now, the thing is, the participants would work for freedom of the seas. That makes sense, because if you want trade barriers to be lowered and to work, if you want economic cooperation between powers, and if you want a world free of want and fear, you're going to need to have movement of goods. And freedom of seas is the critical part for that. Part 8. There was to be a definite disarmament of aggressor nations and a common disarmament after war of some kind. And of course we go straight into the Cold War. One of the fun things that I deal with quite regularly is when I have to explain to people the GDP spent on defence as part of, national income. And there's often a perception that governments used to spend a lot more of their percentage of GDP on defence than they do today. And that was ruining the economy and was taking up all the money. And then you actually go and look at the actual figures and the actual graphs, and you find that on average the British usually spend roughly 3% on defence. What's included in defence spending has been interesting and has changed over time, and it has been more recently been going well below that, but most of the time, from most of the history, especially if you start off from about 1850 and work to today, it's usually about 3%. Apart from in times of actual war. There were some peaks during the early 1900s, and 1900 to sort of about 1900 to 1904 again, war going on there. There's similar ones in 1856, and there's massive peaks during World War One and World War Two. But realistically, there's even the peak during the Cold War, but that dips below 5% by about 1983, and it's been going down ever since. And even in the interwar years, 1920s and 30s, for most of the time it's 2.6 to 2.7%. In simple terms, they're not spending that much on defence to begin with. So, in fact, it's been consistent for so long, one would almost think that's what you should be roughly spending in peacetime. You should be spending roughly 3% of your GDP. And also, when you start to look at other countries, that seems to be roughly what they do. You still never find them in a scenario where they go to war and they go, we've got everything we need, we're brilliantly prepared. But they tend to be okay. They tend to have spent enough in terms of insurance, although realistically alliances are more insurance and defence is more things like the equivalent of your fire service, your police service, and your ambulance service in terms of that sort of scenario. Probably more, depends which branch you're on, which one it is. But the thing is, you have these forces for when you need them, and they have to be funded properly to be available, to be the core of the force you're going to go and expand out. Because if you hadn't been spending 3% on the UK defence spending at this point, if you hadn't been doing that, then there is no way you can then jump so quickly from 3% up to, well, by 1937 you're at 3.69, 1939 you're at 4.5% on defence, 1941 you've gone up to 37.98% of defence budget of GDP is being spent on defence. It peaks in 1945 at nearly 53.5% of GDP being spent on defence. 46 has only dropped down to 45.95, so pretty much near enough makes no difference, 46%. And even by 1947, it's gone down to 16.74%. Its next highest peak after that will be 1952 with about 11.5%. But this is the point. You need to have your defence spending at a point at which it will provide for your peacetime needs, it will provide for your initial war problems if you find yourself in a major war, and provide you the ability to expand in a major war. And why am I saying all this? Well, because it's a very easy one to sign up to, number 8, isn't it? If you consider in 1941, Britain is spending Well, in total on its defence, it's spending 37.98%, 38% of GDP on defence. So if I really think you're going to be cutting down to probably about 3% of spending post-war, there's already going to be some common disarmament going on, and you can sign up to this completely happily, knowing it means absolutely zilch. Because, let's be honest, if you're cutting from 38% of GDP on defence spending to 3%, then that's probably going to be a massive cut in defence spending. An absolute massive cut, which is probably going to lead to some disarmament, won't it? It's always lovely when these things come together. So this causes actually quite a lot of debate, because there are points here which don't make either side particularly happy. Honestly, the Americans want more freedom, more concrete statements there, and the British are going, this is a war we're in the middle of, we prefer not to make things concrete until we have to. We prefer to be able to make it right first. And you can understand both sides, realistically. One side was sitting there fighting the war going, well, you're doing everything but joining this war. And the other side is sitting there going, we'll join the war, but only once all our conditions have been met. And then we think we will probably get the people on side to join the war. So we might actually not join the war, even if you do meet all these conditions. It's a very difficult bargaining position for both sides, realistically. It is. With that being said, how those at the conference felt about it depended on who you're talking to. Now, as is often the way, the people at the conference, they were suitably impressed with the charter when it came out. They were suitably happy with it. But honestly, the whole point of the conference was not really the charter. The charter is a nice piece of window dressing. The charter looks good, sounds good. What's important about this conference are all the meetings going on aside. Are all discussions happening where Lord Breedenbrook is chatting away with people and talking about procurement, working out how to streamline industrial cohesiveness and all those things. That is where the important stuff is really being discussed. As is often the case again with international relations and these big conferences, always look beyond what is the official statements to come out, the big documents to come out. Because they're going to tell you maybe a third or a quarter of the story. They are going to be the big reason why they're all getting together, but there's going to be lots of little reasons, and those little reasons might be little because they don't want to talk about them publicly, so they're not big in that way, or they might be little because they truly are little, or they might be little because they only really matter to a few people, but they matter a lot to those people, and that's enough to be able to move things. So again, there's a lot of discussions going on here. This is one of those conferences which doesn't really get talked about as much when we're talking about World War II. We usually start talking about Yalta, we usually talk about Tehran and Potsdam. Those are usually where we start talking about. But we do have to think about also these meetings where it's just two of those nations getting together and chatting, and all the bilateral agreements which can go along with that, and there are. And what's really fun is that a year later than this, a year after this conference, well, Winston Churchill is meeting with Joseph Stalin in Moscow. There is no Roosevelt there. There is Averell Harriman there. Averell Harriman. Remember this person already mentioned today, who's the special envoy to Europe, who's in charge of Lend-Lease, who's acting there as an eminent dignitary of the United States. Well, he's there at the Moscow conference in 1942. No Roosevelt. And realistically, at that point, it's Churchill and Stalin who are the principals. And it's Churchill who's having to deal with Stalin's active imagination when it comes to certain things and active personality. But it works. It works. Although, interestingly enough, and this is, again, worthwhile noting, you'll actually find more written about the day-to-day of those talks than you will about the Atlantic Charter and its conference, because they're together from the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th of August, 4 days in 1941. And you try and find a decent timeline and breakdown of what everyone's doing in that period. Whereas if you look for the Anglo-Soviet meeting, or rather the Moscow Conference of 1942, where there is Averell Harriman there, so there is an American there. You can find quite a few breakdowns of exactly what they're doing on the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th of August, and the 16th of August. Especially their time in Stalin's apartment. They have fun there. And guess who's also there? One Alexander Cadogan. Again, he's there to assist. And he's another of those people who goes around. Whenever Churchill's going, he's one of the people who Churchill likes to have with him. He's one of the people who explains to Lord Halifax what the Prime Minister's been up to on the foreign stage, when Halifax is supposed to be the Foreign Minister and Foreign Secretary and doing all these things. There's the great phrase from the Moscow Conference of, well, I found Winston and Stalin and Molotov, who had joined them, sitting with a heavily laden board between them, food of all kinds, crowned by a sucking pig, and innumerable bottles. What Stalin made me drink seemed pretty savage. Winston, who by that time was complaining of a slight headache, seemed wisely to be confining himself to a comparatively innocuous, effervescent Caucasian red wine. Everyone seemed merry as a marriage bell. That is the point at which, at 0100 hours on the 16th of August, Cadogan found Stalin and Churchill together in Stalin's apartment. They dined together from 2 a.m. till 2:30 a.m. and were generally chatting away happily, merrily. And again, we know they did this. We know Churchill and Roosevelt were up talking all hours. We know all sorts of people were talking at all hours throughout this meeting. And yet, apparently, what we get out of it is a lot of positive things. Everyone seems to be very positive. And this document, which is interpreted by the rest of the world, as you can imagine, by the rest of the world. So it starts off with number 1. Their countries seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other. They don't seek to make themselves look any more important or any more powerful than they actually are. They desire to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. Slightly different phraseology, it's going okay. They respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Again, not bad. Not bad, it's all fine. Nothing really much there to disagree with. They will endeavour, with the due respect for their existing obligations, to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity. Let's go back to again. Number 4 was going to be trade barriers ought to be lowered for all involved. Well, that fits. That fits. It does fit. 5. They desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labour standards, economic advancement and social security. Again, nothing bad in it. After the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurances that all men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. It's nice, but it's not all men will live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. It's, nations within their own boundaries, which afford assurance that all men in the lands. It's been watered down quite a large chunk. Such a peace should enable all men to traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance. Well, that's a nice way of putting freedom of the seas. And the thing is, when it's put succinctly, that kind of has more force, doesn't it? The moment you add in more words, you are adding in a lot more statements. If we go again back to summed up, barring 5 and 8, they were pretty much, and 2, 5, 8 and 2, they were all single lines. And, well, I suppose 6 is 2 lines. I suppose 6 is just about onto 2 lines. But, you know, these are far more. 8. They believe that all of the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force. Since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers, they believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all other practical measures which will lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments. Wow. It's so full of phrasing, yet it gives you no timeline, no guarantees. Just something they want to aim for. The Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter. Now, of course, this does have an impact on the wider world. This does have an impact. For the Axis nations, for Germany and Italy at this point, it's kind of a case of, oh, is this Wilson's points again? Is this Wilson's sort of statement of, we'll accept peace as long as it's on these terms? And you look at them and go, are they really terms for peace? What are they? It's a lovely statement to make. It's something which is held up quite regularly. You will hear people refer to the Atlantic Charter and what it's made impacted the world and the things it established. And I would say it has established a lot, but it wasn't necessarily going to establish a lot. It established a lot in retrospect because people referred to it and built upon it. But when it was first being agreed and put out there, honestly, it's a set of nice words for Churchill and Roosevelt to both sign up to say what they were doing together for the last 4 days. To tell the world, this is what we were meeting for. This is what we were discussing. No, we weren't discussing how many aircraft and what the terms treaties were for, the various negotiations going on the cost of having ships repaired, etc., and what we're going to do in case of war in the Pacific, and how we're going to sort out maneuver forces, and how we're going to cooperate. We weren't discussing any of that. No. We're discussing this very important document. This is, we are told, takes 4 days to sort out and agree. 4 days. Now, I realise governments work slow, and that's the meme anyway. In my experience, it depends on the situation and the department and the context you're dealing with. But no one in this scenario is working this slow. Not even Churchill and Roosevelt are working this slow. And I realise there is this here with passionate notes written on it. I realise there is. And I'm sure there was a passionate discussion on it, because both Roosevelt and Churchill are enough politicians that they are going to worry about the words and form of things that they could be signing up to. But realistically, this is a very nice thing to have out there. It's very nice to have out there. It does accomplish, and it does encapsulate some war aims, or rather perhaps post-war aims, for how the world should look. But it's nice covering idealism to provide cover for what is the practicality and pragmatism going on in terms of the discussions. Because again, you look at the people who were there. What are they to deal with? They're to deal with, you've brought to discuss all these things about disarmament and peace, you've brought a whole load of military officers. A whole load of naval and of admirals and air force officers and army officers. You've brought all these people here together. You've brought a very couple of diplomats, but mostly you've brought people who are to do with the supply team, the supply chain. And you're going to tell me you brought all those people together and it was to discuss this Atlantic Charter? No. And everyone at the time realistically knew it wasn't. But the thing is, they needed something to cover. They needed something to come out of the conference. If you look at the various other conferences they have, they always come out with something. Something which you can give to the world's press. Something which you can give to the world to show this is what we've been doing. It's not so much creating plausible deniability as it is creating a narrative for events that will allow your opponent to overlook them should they wish. For America, not yet in the war, this is a nice statement to sign up to. It's not, they weren't there discussing joining the war. They were there discussing this. How dare you accuse them they were planning on joining World War II? How dare you accuse the Honourable Roosevelt of this? He was there discussing something which is good for the future of all mankind. And should you be popular? Well, look. Number 3 says they respect the rights of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Are you saying that the people of Germany won't pick you to be their leader again? Or people of Italy? How can you read any threat into that? How could you consider any threats in that? Admittedly, yes, you're occupying other nations, but, that is not something we're getting involved in. We're just saying that after this is over, no one should be seeking aggrandizement. No one should be taking over other territories. No. So let's consider the consequences of this all. Now, I will admit, I once read a very interesting paper which basically said the Atlantic Charter was what inspired Mahatma Gandhi to go for Indian independence. It was the Charter which inspired him. Apparently, nothing else before had. I don't think the person who wrote that was particularly well read when it came to the history of the Indian independence movement. I really don't. And I don't think a lot of the things statements which put forward that this was the end of empires, it's not. It does have consequences, but they're the natural consequences already of the war. If you're fighting a war basically for states' rights to determine themselves rather than might makes right, then at a certain point you're fighting a war for something which is already happening. The interesting thing is when you look at this map and you go, well, it's the reason I picked this one is it's United Kingdom as in the empire, and what are dominions? India's a dominion by this point. They're not fully down the path of dominion, but they are getting most of the way there. A lot of these places are on the dominionization course. A lot of these pieces of red are on the dominionization track, as Britain calls it. And dominion basically means you're completely self-governing, apart from that, to an extent when it comes to foreign policy. And even the foreign policy limitations, well, you're allowed to make economic agreements. You're allowed to be pushing your own economic agreements and trade agreements to an extent. We prefer you to do imperial first, but, imperial preference, but trade agreements are fine. We're pragmatic. Realistically, what we don't want you doing is declaring war or negotiating peace treaties. That's got to be something we do as a group. And buying into the whole empire as a whole as a force. But that's sort of the British Empire is already heading down what we would call the Commonwealthization route, Dominionization / Commonwealthization route. France. Well, France is a massive empire, but a huge amount of it is desert. This is what people often forget about the French Empire. A huge chunk of it is desert. It really is. Huge chunk of it is desert. And this is what they look like after 1945, and some of those territories which the British are in control and the French are in control of formerly belonged to Italy and other places, and they have been taken over for the end of the war. The biggest consequence, realistically, of the Atlantic Charter is it starts building a framework and sets up allows for the cover for a lot more negotiations and framework to build up so that when war does begin and they do end up fighting alongside each other, the reason why the Allies are able to cooperate so quickly and actually integrate as quickly as they do, which is often said to be an amazing feat that they accomplish in such a short time, well, the thing is, the groundwork and foundations of it have been being laid for about 18 months to 2 years, it's arguable, by the time the Americans actually joined the war. By the time the Americans joined the war, those negotiations and things have been going on for roughly 18 months to 2 years, depending on which meetings you consider and which ones you talk about. The long-term consequences are it starts to build a framework and starts people thinking about what the future of the world is going to look like post-war. I would really argue the Atlantic Charter, the biggest impact it has is it starts making people think about what's going to happen after the war is over. They're conceiving not of fighting the next battle, not of winning the next campaign, but of what the end of the war is going to look like. What the world is going to look like. What it's going to be formed from. And that's important. This is important as you slowly move on to getting the other allies involved, eventually forming the United Nations, all these things. That is important because you are building the bricks which are going to make the walls of the future world, are going to shape it and form it. And that's, broadly speaking, what the Atlantic Charter was about. It has other consequences. It does. It does give further arguments and gives further resource to those independence campaigns to point to, and it does give reason for America to be putting pressure on British and other imperial powers and for constantly pushing the accelerator on it. But the thing is, that stuff was already happening. It was. It was already part of the world, the mood music of the world going on at the time. With that being said, though, I always finish these videos with a question. And I think the question is, would the impact of it being different, and do you think the negotiations were different, if Prince of Wales, instead of being the ship she was, had somehow managed to sink the Bismarck at the Battle of the Denmark Straits? So Hood still got lost, but Bismarck herself gets sunk by the Prince of Wales. Her guns work. Would that have had a different impact on the negotiations and on the framing and imagery of the negotiations if it had been Prince of Wales's 10-14-inch guns which had sunk the Bismarck at that battle? I'd love to hear your point of view, because my thinking is, well, she's there, she's a symbol of Britain's willingness to fight and to keep fighting and carry on fighting. But if she was a symbol of British victory at that meeting, Does that change some of the context? Does that change some of the politics to come out of it? Does it change some of the scenarios for Roosevelt with that imagery? Be really interested to hear what you think. Alright, coming up, well, when this video comes out, we are going to be past the year of leadership and into the year of... You'll know what year it is, but I do find it funny when I'm organising things. I'm going to have to write up the year and the next year, the year 2026, and start putting it on these videos so that when they're recorded, when they go out live, they are current. This can sort of stand for January. It can't really stand once I get into February. Thank you very much for watching. The year of videos always come out on a Tuesday at 7:30 UK time. Whether it's British summertime or Greenwich Mean Time, depending on what's happening. Then there's a live Thursdays at 7:30. There is usually a key ships, key leaders, or key aircraft on Friday at 7:30. There are these recorded videos which come out on most Saturdays at 7:30. There are 2 Saturdays a month where it's patron premieres, which are those which you get 3rd and 4th in the patron vote at 7:30. And then Sundays there is Brew Ships at 7:30. And the thing is, Brew Ships and the Thursday live, so this video and Brew Ships, are both dual streamed on Twitch and YouTube. So dual streamed. And I do that to try and reach as many people as possible and answer as many naval history questions as possible, especially on Brew Ships, which is all about answering on naval history questions. It really is a lot of fun. Thank you very much for watching, and take care. Toodles.